We might wonder what kind of a church we are, and evidently it seems we're the kind of church where you can have a little bit of fun sometimes. Hopefully we're also the kind of church where you take things seriously as well, and that we have those solemn moments as well. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Sandra. Well, there are kinds of churches, and well, actually there's a lot of people in our world, or especially here in North America, who don't feel comfortable in any kind of church, really. There are people who don't feel comfortable in churches. They have this perception of things that have happened, whether scandals that have happened because in churches and by pastors and clergy, or maybe it's abusive clergy. There's certainly been reports of that kind of thing. And so some people don't feel comfortable in churches. Also, there are things like, well, just thinking of the indigenous peoples and the scandals over the schools and the residential schools. That has made some people feel uncomfortable with Christianity. There's politics. Some people are going to think of politics within a church, but others are going to think of how certain churches kind of get behind certain politicians. And so politics pursued actively by churches in some ways can make a lot of people feel uncomfortable with Christianity. Or there's also this perception that we don't take seriously science or higher education, and we're not taking that seriously. So there's all kinds of people perceiving things about the church that makes them feel uncomfortable with the idea of being part of a church or going to a church. And we might wonder, and you know, with some churches maybe more than others, we might wonder if Jesus himself would feel at home in certain churches. And we want to be the kind of church where we would hope that Jesus himself would feel at home amongst us. And so we're going to take a look at that. And as we take a look at that, we're going to recognize that's going to be the kind of church that takes seriously his teaching and his example and his life, death, and resurrection. It's going to be the kind of church where Jesus would feel at home. Actually, I think we're going to find would be the kind of church that many of us would feel at home in. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to find out what a church looks like that Jesus would feel comfortable in? Well, you've all met Pastor Ray, and I'm so grateful for the work he did throughout the spring and summer while I was on sabbatical. And he was your interim pastor for that time, and I trust you got to know him, and he got to know you, and I know he is very pleased to do so. Did you know, perhaps you didn't know, that he is actually the leader, the executive director? We want to shy away, I think, from using the language of he's the pastor of a different kind of church, but he is the leader, he's the executive director of, let's call it an entity. It's kind of a community of people. It's called Open Table Communities. And what this is, well, I really should have just asked Ray to come and describe what it is. But it is, well, there's a lot of people today with, well, let's just say that church attendance has been in decline over the years, and it has accelerated through COVID. That's just a phenomenon throughout the world, really, in North America especially, in the Western world. But a lot of people are, we call them the nuns and duns. That is, when it comes time in a survey to ask what is your religious affiliation, they'll put none. But there are those too who would call them the duns. In other words, they were brought up Christian perhaps, or there's something in their background about Christianity that at one point they would have said, yes, I'm a Christian, I identify as a Christian. But now you ask them and they'll say, no, I'm not sure I want to identify as a Christian. I'm not sure I want to be known as a Christian. And some would go as far as to say, I'm done with Christianity, I'm done with church, I'm done with churches. And so that's kind of a group of people that are nicknamed the duns. So what is Open Table Communities? There's much more to it, and you can ask Ray the next time you see him about that much more to it. But my perception of it is it's really a community of people who are concerned for others and want to say to them, before you throw out the baby with the bathwater, let's take a look at that baby. Let's take a look at that bathwater. Before you throw out the baby with the bathwater, let's take a look at the baby in the bathwater and give Jesus a second consideration, because there's more to it than just being done with Christianity. You might feel done with Christianity and with churches, but look again to Jesus. And maybe it's not time to be done with him. Maybe it's actually time to begin with him. And maybe someday that will lead you back into thinking more about Christianity as a whole, having considered Jesus. So that's what Open Table Communities is. It's really something that is very important in our day today, and I think will be important 5 years from now, 10 years from now, as trends continue, as more and more people will be no religious affiliation, or I'm done with Christianity. I think Open Table Communities is a beautiful thing, and I think we want to prayerfully support Ray and his work with Open Table Communities. Now, Open Table Communities happens to have 8 cultural statements, and what these are is kind of guiding principles of how Open Table Communities says you can expect us to operate this way. This is how we work. This is how things work amongst us here. This is the kind of community we are, and the kinds of things you can expect. And as I went through those 8 things, it really struck me, that's the kind of community Jesus would feel at home in. And not only is it great for something like a new kind of faith community not only good for a new kind of faith community, but it's also good for an old-fashioned kind of church like we are. And so we're going to actually look at those 8 cultural statements as a way into looking at the kind of church that Jesus would feel at home in. So these are actually taken from the Open Table Communities, but as I looked through them, I was like, ping, ping, ping. The Bible speaks to those. And if I were to preach through stuff in the Bible about what is the kind of church that gets Jesus, these would be it. And so that's why I chose to really focus in on these 8 cultural statements, they call them. But I would like to call them the values of a church who really Jesus would feel at home in. And I think we're going to discover that others will feel at home there also. So let's take a look at the first one, and I think Sandra's going to put the slide up for us here. Let's just read through the first one, and then we're going to dive into it. So here's the first one. We nurture cultures, that's kind of a way of being, a way of acting towards one another, that are anchored in the Jesus story, his life, death, and resurrection. We nurture a view of God that is seen through the lens of Christ, and consider this way of seeing God, the world, and human activity is conducive to all human flourishing. Now, there's a lot to that. And thankfully, we are going to start tomorrow night a small group that will look into the lot that is there. I'm not going to preach through all of it. I had the opportunity yesterday at the Celebration of Life, the funeral service for Reg Fulton, had the opportunity to think of Reg and Myrtle, and I can still picture where they would sit in our church family. And Reg, I credit him with giving me one of the biggest compliments ever that I've received. I won't tell you what it is. But Myrtle gave me one of the best pieces of advice ever given to me. I will tell you what it is, and that is to preach shorter sermons. So if you knew Myrtle, you would know well that that would be fitting for Myrtle. And I think she would enjoy me saying that this morning. She would have a smile on her face. So actually, I'm not going to preach through everything that you read there. But we are going to look at it more Monday night, but also Wednesday morning. Wednesday morning is going to be 10 o'clock here in the Friendship Room, here in person at the church. Monday evenings is going to be online through Zoom. So if you want to join either one of them, and you can show up to either one of them, and each week is kind of independent. So if you want to latch on to one of the sessions but not the rest, that's fine. Or 2 or 3 of the sessions, or all of them, it's up to you. So that's going to be there for us. But let's take a look at this one this morning. Why would we want to anchor everything in Jesus? Why would we want to anchor our faith and who we are as a church family in Jesus? And the first answer to that one is because he said to. Pretty straightforward, right? He said to. Where did he say that? Well, we can go back to the Sermon on the Mount, and there's so much in the Sermon on the Mount, but throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus was saying things like, you have heard it said, it has been said before, but now I say to you. You have heard it said, but now I say to you. In other words, listen up. Even though you've given so much attention to what has been said, and we find so much in the Old Testament about that, but he's like, now I say to you. And notice how he concludes the Sermon on the Mount with these words. And I'm looking at Matthew chapter 7, starting at verse 24. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. Now, I think we've all seen images in recent days of houses built on rocks, and it did indeed look like they were going to be swept into the sea. But Jesus makes the point here, you're going to fare much better with a house built on rock than everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Building a house on rock. And what is that house on rock? What does Jesus say? Does he say, now everybody, you have to listen to Moses. You have to listen to the law. You have to listen to... What does he say? He says, listen to me. Build your life, and also therefore build the life of your communities as you gather together as church families. Build it on me and what I say. Paying attention to Jesus, listening to him. Furthermore, he goes on at the end of Matthew chapter 28, when he says, and Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father and of the Son. Notice how he's including himself there, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. Again, Jesus said it. Not teaching them to obey the law, not teaching them to obey the things you're used to obeying, teaching them to obey what I have taught you. Listen to me. Focus in on me. Learn from me. Anchor yourselves in me. So that's the first thing. Jesus tells us to focus in on him and to listen to him. So the kind of church that Jesus would feel right at home in is one that's doing that. Listening to him, focused in on him, zeroing in on him, being anchored in him, his life, his example, his teaching, his death and resurrection, and all that it means. But why listen to Jesus? You know, it's one thing for Jesus to say, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, so listen to me. It's one thing for Jesus to say, the wise man builds his house upon the rock, and my words are the ones you want to listen to do that. But if you had a friend come up and say to you, and keep in mind here, Jesus is saying, listen to me more than Moses. Well, if you had a friend come up to you and say, listen to me more than Jesus, what would you think? You would think you're off your rocker, right? You're crazy. If you had somebody come up to you and say, all authority is under heaven has been given to me, therefore go and teach people to obey me and listen to me, wouldn't you say, you're off your rocker, you're crazy? And would probably be correct. So why, therefore, did the disciples listen to Jesus when he said to do that? Well, for one thing, your friends probably aren't giving the same kind of life that the disciples saw of Jesus going around and healing people, of Jesus going around and teaching, and as it says, teaching with authority. People knew that his teaching was different. But then also there was a significant event. And think back to the last 2 Sundays, if you've been with us, when we looked at Sabbath. Boy, that was a long-standing tradition, and all of a sudden things are being thought about differently. Or Sundays. There was never this tradition of gathering together on Sundays to worship. Where did that come from? Again, it comes back to the commemoration of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. What happened that everything suddenly changed? Jesus rose from the dead. And so when Jesus said, listen to me, The fact that Jesus rose from the dead, they're like, yes, he is the one to listen to. It's not the same as if one of our friends would say, listen to me, and all authority has been given to me. It's not like that at all. This is, he taught with authority. He healed with authority. He commanded the wind and the waves on the sea. And then he rose from the dead. And so when he says, listen to me, the disciples are like, yeah, we're going to do that. When he says, all authority in heaven has been given unto me, remember at that moment, this is at the end of Matthew, after he is risen from the dead. This is the risen Jesus showing himself to the disciples and saying, all authority has been given to me. And so they're like, yeah, we're going to listen to that. And the disciples are going to think back to the kinds of things Jesus said, like, you don't put new wine in old wineskins. You put new wine in new wineskins. And they're going to remember things like that and things Jesus taught. And they're going to say, yeah, now is the time for new wineskins. Because Jesus has risen from the dead and that changes everything. And the disciples knew it. So we're going to listen to him. That's what partly it means to put new wine in new wineskins, is to what needs to change. The disciples needed to figure that out. The apostles needed to figure that out. What needs to change now for us to actually listen to Jesus and anchor our lives, anchor everything we do as Christ followers together in Jesus and what he said? And we ask that same question today too. What do the new wineskins look like that are needed as we anchor ourselves in the teaching of Jesus, anchor ourselves in who Jesus is, his death and resurrection? Now, we still might be listening to that and saying, well, wait a minute. Okay, that's fine for the disciples. They had risen Jesus right in front of him. But how do we know that, well, this book here, the Bible, is not all just made up? How do we know that they just didn't make up that Jesus appeared to them? That somebody didn't just write that up a long time after and pass it off as truth when it's not true? How can we know that? I love it when you ask questions. You ask such good questions. And somebody has written a book that answers that very question. It's called Beautiful and Believable. And the point is, really, that to answer that question, you could write a book about it. There are many reasons, really, that we can say, you know what, this is true. When we talk about Jesus, it is beautiful, but it's also believable. There's reasons to do so. Reasons enough to write a whole book about it. And if you want to read that book, you don't have to buy it. There's 2 copies at the back that are now part of the library. Feel free to take it. And by the way, it's free on if you buy the ebooks, but not Kindle. It's not free, but Amazon gets all the money for that. I don't get any. And if you do buy the book, the paper copy, which is available at Searchlight Books, I make enough money off each that is sold to buy half a coffee. All right? With inflation. So buy 2, and then I can have a full coffee, all right? So you can read one and give the other one away. But anyway, I'm not here to sell books. But the point is, when I give the reason for my hope, and that's the subtitle for that book, I could write a book about it. There's so many reasons. And to get the gist of why Jesus, why anchor ourselves in Jesus and not someone else, Muhammad, Buddha, or our own thinking? There's something unique about Jesus. In the history of the world, there is something about that name. There's something absolutely unique about Jesus. Worth, for those who have looked at been through Christianity and said they're done with it, there's something, go back to Jesus, there's something about Jesus. Worth that second look, worth that third look, worth that fourth look, worth digging deeper into who is this Jesus and why does it matter to me? And there's something about Jesus, and it's beautiful, and it speaks to God's desire for our relationship now and through eternity. There's something about Jesus. So why Jesus, and why anchor ourselves in Jesus and not someone or something else? There's many reasons that we can say about that. Now, what are some of the other things that we might anchor ourselves into? Well, there's a few things, and actually there's probably some things that we probably daily anchor ourselves into without even realizing it, and maybe sometimes even more than Jesus. For example, here's one place where we, as Westerners, tend to put a lot of trust in this. And you do this every time you have a headache and you reach for a Tylenol or an aspirin. We do this when we go and get vaccinated, and not just for COVID, but when we give our children vaccinations. We do this every time you open your phone and start it up. What are you depending upon? Science. You would not have that phone without science. We would not have Tylenol or aspirins without science. We wouldn't have vaccinations without science. We wouldn't be able to go to the doctor and experience the help that we can receive from the doctors and nurses and the medical staff if it were not for science. So guess what? Science is amazing. Science is great. We do want to pay attention to it. But science can't teach us everything. So we can't actually anchor our faith, we can't anchor our lives in science and science alone. Actually, we anchor our faith in Jesus, recognizing that science is a beautiful and good thing. But we want to anchor our faith in Jesus, how we read about Jesus in the Bible. So science, there's one. Here's another one, philosophy. And some people might anchor their faith in philosophy and thinking through things. And like science, philosophy is good and necessary. And theologians and you and I think, need to think through faith. And that's using philosophy. Anytime you're thinking through things, there's a philosophical element to that. The word philosophy just means love of knowledge, love of learning. And we want to be able to think through things. So philosophy itself is good. But philosophy by itself can't teach us everything. And there are things that we're only going to know through Jesus. So again, we anchor our faith in Jesus. Philosophy is great, but we anchor our faith in Jesus. Another thing would be experience. And experience is good. We learn through experience. But again, we anchor our faith in Jesus. Or tradition, and tradition can be very helpful and very good. It can also take you down the wrong path, but it can be very good. But again, we anchor ourselves in Jesus. So there's all these things that are good in themselves, but they're not going to take us all the way that we want to go in faith. Science is good. Experience is good. Tradition can be good. Philosophy can be good. But we anchor ourselves in Jesus. And here's another one, social media. And just as the other things are good, social media, well, there's social media, right? So and some people will actually anchor their lives. Some people will anchor their faith and their belief system in social media and the kinds of things you read there. And maybe that could be good depending on what people are sharing there, but it can also be very bad. We anchor ourselves in Jesus. And social media can maybe help us do that. But pop culture. Some people anchor their faith and their belief systems and how they live through pop culture. We want to pay attention to pop culture and know what's happening in society. But we anchor our faith in Jesus. We want to be the kind of church that anchors itself in Jesus and the Jesus story of his death and resurrection and his teaching. We want to be that kind of church. That's the kind of church Jesus would feel at home in. He wouldn't feel at home in a community where we just talk about science, or we just talk about experience, or we just talk about any of these other things. But we want to be talking about Jesus. We anchor our faith in him. Well, being anchored in Jesus and the Jesus story, it also is, and we're not going to touch on this one very much, but it talks about looking at everything through the lens of Jesus. We nurture a view of God that is seen through the lens of Christ and consider how this way of seeing God and everything else, the world and human activity, So this idea of having Jesus glasses on so that we see what God is like through the lens of Jesus. And here's a question we could ask is, what would your belief about God be if all you had was science? What would you think about God and how we are as people? What would your belief about God be if all you had was experience and nothing more? What would your belief about God be if all you had was the Old Testament of the Bible and nothing more? And you didn't have Jesus. What would your belief about God be if all you had was social media? These are good questions. And what is our belief of God and everything else through the lens of Jesus and getting to know Jesus better through the Scriptures? Important questions. And we're not going to spend too much time on that right now. Again, there's the small groups where we can unpack that more. But here's another thing too, is the idea of flourishing there. That this way of Jesus, of being anchored in Jesus, we look at how looking at everything will cause us to seek human flourishing. It's conducive to human flourishing. Why human flourishing? Why is that a goal? Well, we can look to things that Jesus said, like, I come that you may have life and life more abundant. That's John 10:10. And so there's a moment of looking at Jesus looking for people to flourish. We can, when we focus in on Jesus, we're going to find that oftentimes he focused in on us and what he can do for us, the grace, the love. As we focus on Jesus, we discover he's focused on us. And I love our tagline, helping people walk with Jesus in faith, hope, and love. Have you noticed something about that tagline? There's only one verb in it. And it's a beautiful verb. What is it? Now you're going through English grammar lessons, right? What is a verb? It's an action word, right? It's the activity. Helping. Helping people walk with Jesus. Helping. So we have this idea of helping people flourish right in our tagline. Maybe we didn't realize that, but we do. Helping people. And again, there's more to say about that, but we're going to unpack that more to say as part of the small groups. Monday night at 7 p.m. and through Zoom, or Wednesday morning, 10 a.m. here. Is this starting to sound like an infomercial for the small groups? And you also have the opportunity to buy this. No. Yeah. But anyway, but it would be, if that's helpful for you to join in our small groups, either Monday night or Wednesday morning, it would be great to have you with us. But to bring this to conclusion then, here at Calvary, we do want to be the kind of church where Jesus would feel right at home. It's the kind of church, really, that we could say gets Jesus. Gets his teaching, gets his example and how that impacts us, gets what his death and resurrection is all about. It's the kind of church that gets Jesus. That's the kind of church that Jesus is going to feel at home in. And what does that look like? Well, this week we're looking at, it's the kind of church that is anchored in Jesus. Again, that's part of our tagline too, right? Helping people do what? Walk with Jesus in faith, hope, and love. Amen.